Okay, today we are thinking about quotas. So, what is a quota? A quota is a form of affirmative action that sets a minimum or maximum percentage of a certain group of people who's allowed to do something. So, a really good example of quotas used in this way is all women shortlists, which are used by the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats when they are selecting candidates for particular constituencies in a general election. And they have these sets of candidates where every candidate on that list has to be a woman. And that's basically a quota with 100% women on it. Another really famous example of a quota being used in affirmative action is something called the Rooney Rule, which is employed by teams in the NFL in America. So the Rooney Rule states that when you're hiring coaches or people in kind of like administrative management roles, then you have to have at least one candidate that you interview from an ethnic minority background. So that's a quota at the interview stage, and it's a quota of whatever number of interview candidates that you're interviewing, one of them has to be from an ethnic minority background. A slightly different example of a quota is used in mixed sports like netball, where the rules of netball basically say that in mixed netball, any team has to have between 2 and 3 men on your team. So all women shortlists and the Rooney Rule, they're used to give an opportunity for people who are disproportionately underrepresented to be included. And mixed netball is basically saying that there are advantages and disadvantages of having men on your team, and in order to make the teams balanced, we're going to set a range of the number of men that you're allowed on your team. So why do we use quotas? Well, the main reason why we use quotas in affirmative action is to try and overcome structural inequality. So there are a couple of different ways that quotas do that. One thing that a lot of people use quotas or can use quotas to do is increase diversity in an organization. If you realize that a lot of the people in your organization look the same, you might say, okay, what should our organization actually looks like? Let's set some kind of like targets and figures, and these will be our quotas that we're going to try and get to make sure that there are more voices, more different kinds of experiences in our organization. Another thing that quotas try to do is combat underrepresentation. So you might look at the people in your organization and you might say, we're actually missing a lot of people from this group. And when we compare the proportion of people from that group in our organization to, say, the national average, it tells us that there are a lot less people from this group than there would be if we just hired people at random. And that means that there's some kind of discrimination happening that's leading to this underrepresentation. And so we're going to set a target for ourselves to try and combat that underrepresentation. Basically, the idea behind quotas is to make the system fair. What they're trying to do is say, if we just let people into our organization completely at random, whether that was at the interview stage, at the management stage, we're looking at promotions, whatever it is, what we want is for the kind of like demographics of our organization to look as if they have just been completely chosen at random, so that we're not skewed in favor of one particular group. And we think if we can do that, that means the system is fairer than it is now. So who are these kind of groups of people that quotas are designed to help? Well, when we talk about affirmative action, what we're talking about is trying to benefit groups of people who are in the minority and marginalized because of that minority status or because of the way that they are different to the rest of the population. So we're looking at groups like people of color or women or non-binary folk, but we might also be looking at immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers, or maybe just people who have English as a second language. We might be looking at travelling communities, deaf and disabled community, people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, or the LGBTQIA plus communities. So there are lots and lots of different people who face some form of structural discrimination, and quotas can be used to benefit those groups. How exactly are they doing that? How are they benefiting those groups? Well, the idea behind quotas is kind of threefold. The first thing that quotas are trying to do is, or are designed to do, is incentivize organizations to look for suitable candidates. And the reason why this is kind of one of the ways that quotas work is because often when an organization is discriminating against a group of people, or there is a particular type of person who's underrepresented within an organization, the organization might claim or use the excuse that, oh, well, we just couldn't find any suitable candidates, or we just didn't get enough applicants. So an organization that maybe is hiring a lot more men than women for specific roles, they might say, well, we just didn't get as many women applying as we did men. And what quotas do is they say, well, maybe we don't care about how many people are applying to your organization. You've still got to hit this target. And so if there's a problem with the number of people who are applying, then you need to change your hiring practices. You maybe need to change where you're advertising your jobs, how you're phrasing your job descriptions to encourage particular groups of people. And if that doesn't work, then maybe you've got to go out and specifically look for people from that community and approach them first and ask them to apply for jobs. So what quotas are doing is they're sort of setting a target, and that if that target is not met, then there might be some kind of punishment, and that's designed to incentivize that organization to actually look for those suitable candidates and change the system to make sure that they can't kind of use a lack of applicants as an excuse. The second thing that quotas can do is give marginalized groups kind of a foot in the door. So we have a system where if you have a system where it is harder for some people to maybe apply for a job or to be considered for a promotion, or even get like an opportunity for an interview, for some reason or another, quotas might be the thing that makes it easier for them to get into that position. So, for example, there are some communities of people who might find it harder to get hired because it's harder for them to get the necessary qualifications for specific jobs. So people who have barriers to access due to financial constraints, or because of inaccessibility within our education system, or because the qualifications that they got in their home country aren't viewed in the same way here as they were in that country. Lots and lots of different reasons why there are some people who find it harder to be qualified or to be viewed as qualified for a particular job. When you have a quota in place, an organization might be incentivized to look at the qualifications that they do have or the potential that they have differently, and give them an opportunity even if they don't have the original qualifications that were set out in the job description or in the promotion like criteria, or whatever kind of level we're looking at. The other thing that quotas do in terms of giving marginalized groups a foot in the door is brings the kind of like issues of discrimination kind of to the forefront, to make sure that individuals who are making the decisions about who gets hired, who gets promoted, who gets an interview, whatever it is, making them aware of that structural discrimination so that they can check any kind of subconscious biases that they have. So if someone, for example, is presented with job applications from two people that look very, very similar, but then they find out that one person is a man and one person is a woman, there might be some kind of level of subconscious bias that makes them think that the man is subjectively more qualified than the woman. But if they're operating in a system where there's a quota and then there's a target of how many women they actually have to progress to the next stage, they might be actively trying to work to counter that subconscious bias. And they might be looking at that woman's application and saying, well, instead of what makes her not qualified, what makes her qualified? The third way that quotas are designed to kind of help with the system is actually in terms of, for those people who have been hired, who are already in the organization, by increasing representation. So if you're in the minority and you're from a marginalized community, that can put a lot of pressure on you as an individual. You might see yourself as having to represent your whole community, and that might make it difficult for you to do your job. Or you might be experiencing microaggressions and discrimination from the people that you work with. Or the organization that you work in might be inaccessible to you. And this is particularly the case for people with disabilities. If you're the first person in your organisation, for example, who's in a wheelchair, they may not have considered the office plan to actually allow you to get around the office. So by increasing representation, and by setting targets that like quotas that say actually you have to have this many people from this particular group in your organization, you increase the number of people, which means that no individual is now like representing their whole community just as one person. But it also means that they might have people who are going through similar kind of experiences to them that they can talk to, and that can be really positive. And if there are issues within the organization, if you are experiencing racism, if you are finding the workspace inaccessible, then you have the like power through numbers and the processes of collective action where you can work with other people from your community to say this is a problem for quite a lot of us, and that has more of an ability to make organizations listen and change. Quotas, despite having like lots of potential benefits, aren't actually widely implemented, and there are lots of people who criticize quotas for a couple of different reasons. So some people think that quotas are in and of themselves discriminatory, so they argue that, you know, if you're going to have an all women shortlist, then that means that no men can get on that shortlist, and that discriminates against men. And whilst that is like maybe true, we have to ask whether or not that's a meaningful use of the word discrimination, because what quotas are designed to do, are they're designed to make an organization that has underrepresentation equal to an organization where people's gender or race or other characteristic isn't a factor, or is no longer a factor, because the demographics are very similar to the kind of like national average. And so what they're doing is they're kind of removing that discrimination. Another argument which is commonly used against quotas is that they tokenize marginalized peoples. So if someone is hired by an organization that employs quotas, then people might be able to say, well, you were only chosen because they needed numbers to fulfill their gender quota or their race quota or their disability quota or whatever. And the problem with this argument is that it assumes that those individuals would not have been hired or were not qualified to be hired anyway. And that in and of itself is kind of, it's a discriminatory way of looking at the world. It's a prejudiced way of looking at the world. Because what quotas are doing is they're saying that actually there are all of these qualified candidates from these marginalized groups. The reason why they're not getting hired is not because they wouldn't be good at that job. It's because there are structural biases within the system that mean that they have additional hoops that they have to jump through to even be considered. And quotas are one out of many mechanisms that you can use to try and remove those structural barriers. So they're not about giving people chances purely because of their characteristics. They're about recognizing that it can be harder to be employed because of some aspects of your identity. And given that, it's one of the ways that we can try and readdress that form of discrimination. The final, like quite commonly made argument against quotas is that they make the system unmeritocratic. So in an ideal world, people argue, we would have a system where individuals are purely judged on their skills and their qualifications. And when we have a system that employs something like quotas, which is saying that actually we should take into account other characteristics, such as parts of our identity that may be targeted for discrimination or prejudice, then that is no longer a meritocratic system. The problem with that argument is that the system currently isn't a meritocracy. There are some people who are advantaged by their, for example, their gender or their race or another aspect of their identity, and they're not benefited because they exist in a system with quotas. They're benefited because they exist in a system with privilege. And what quotas are trying to do is they're trying to readdress that balance to make the system more meritocratic. So there are lots of different ways that you can use quotas, and there are lots of different people who employ quotas in different ways. can you think of a system that might benefit from a quota? So can you think of a system where certain individuals from particular communities are being discriminated against? Do you think that a quota would help to readdress that discrimination? Can you design your quota, so specify what the minimum or maximum percentages of particular groups are, where in your system you're going to be placing that quota, and can you describe whether or not you think this quota will be fair? So what is the quota actually going to change about the system? How is it going to work? And do you think it's going to improve the system for the better?